From the American Academy of Pediatrics.
Beverages or drinks promoted as so-called toddler formulas are not nutritionally complete.
A new report from the AAP warns they're unnecessary and often not as healthy as they claim to be.
They're completely unregulated. It's kind of a Wild West scenario, actually.
Plus, new research about pediatric firearm injuries shows a staggering rise since before the pandemic.
Unfortunately, we found that emergency visits by children for firearm injuries doubled.
These stories and more on Pediatrics on Call, the podcast on children's health from the AAP. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. This podcast is for everyone in the medical community, keeping our children healthy and safe.
It's a show by pediatricians for pediatricians.
But anyone who cares about kids will get a lot out of it as well.
Let's start today's episode with a conversation about so-called toddler formulas and how to counsel families in our care.
When my oldest turned 10 months old, she really didn't want to breastfeed anymore. I tried so many tactics to just keep her going, but eventually I gave up on my goal of a year.
So what did you wind up doing? Did you have to bridge with formula?
I was lucky in that I had some frozen breast milk stored, and she was eating a pretty varied diet at the time. So in consultation with my pediatrician, we opted to start her at 11 months on some cow's milk just to bridge the gap. So I never did use formula with her or with my son, who liked breastfeeding more.
Well, that's great. Any amount of breast milk a parent can give a child is wonderful. And for families that can't do months of breastfeeding or even any breastfeeding, infant formulas are nutrient-packed and do a great job supporting a baby's growth. Where I start to have questions, though, is after the infant period, so around 12 months. How much does formula really help as a driver of adequate growth and nutrition?
That's a great question, David. There seem to be so many more toddler formulas or special milks for young children on the market now. I just went to cow's milk when I ran out of breast milk, but I wonder what the evidence is on these other products.
Well, it's evident we need to do a podcast on this. So let's welcome to the show Dr. George Fuchs. Dr. Fuchs is a professor of pediatrics and epidemiology at the University of Kentucky. He has a lot of subspecialty training in pediatrics, including nutrition, gastroenterology, and infectious diseases, and as a result has researched a lot about child health and nutrition.
He is also first author on the clinical report, Older Infant Young Child Formulas. George, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, so let's get some definitions here. What are older infant or young child formulas, and how do they differ from infant formulas?
Well, David, that's actually part of the problem. There are no uniform or recognized definitions for these different terms of this category of drinks. Unlike infant formulas, which are targeted to infants 0 to 12 months of age, there are no standard definitions of these drinks, nor is there any FDA approval or regulation of these drinks. So they're quite heterogeneous. It can be broadly, I think, segregated into groups based on their target age range. And so 6 to 12 months would be the follow-up formulas or the follow-on formulas. The infants anywhere from 9 months to 24 months are often referred to as transition formulas or sometimes weaning formulas. Infants, toddlers 12 to 36 months of age, they can even be called toddler milks, growing up milks, young child milks, or formulas. All of this is really at the discretion of the company and how they want to market it, because, as I mentioned, there's absolutely no oversight nor any requirements in terms of composition.
I've been seeing a lot more of these in stores and having families ask me more about them. Has there been a surge in what's available?
Yes, there's been quite an increase over the last, I'd say, 10 to 20 years, in particular in North America. I think they've been more represented in other countries, but in North America, they've been dramatically increased in terms of their presence. They're also marketed, if you go to a store, they're alongside infant formulas, which conveys this essential quality that the formulas companies are trying to convey. But yes, they're much more ubiquitous. And this is largely because they represent a greater proportion of the revenue compared to infant formulas in this country today. The proportion of sales and volume and money is progressively decreasing of infant formula, particularly volume. And to the contrary of these toddler drinks, it's increasing as a total of their income and volume of sales. And this is mirrored in the amount of money that they're spending for marketing, which is much more for toddler formulas now than it is for infant formulas.
What is actually in these formulas?
Well, again, they're characterized by great variation, and this reflects the lack of standardization. There are some expert recommendations, and that's all we have to go on, but some are high or actually have too low protein content. Some have higher sodium content compared to cow milk. Many of them have added sugars. I think the majority exceed the amount recommended for toddlers in the expert committee recommendations. Many consider them to be actually sugar-sweetened drinks. This becomes important because there's a phenomena that occurs in this age group of children in which taste is programmed. So if these children are exposed to these sugary beverages at this age, they end up having a potentially lifelong desire for higher sugar content beverages and solid foods. So the sum total is of concern and certainly would benefit from some regulation, in fact.
So just to be clear, there's no regulation?
They're completely unregulated. The FDA has a category of children specifically for 0 to 12 months of age. They have no such category for children older than 12 months of age. And so the Infant Formula Act, which was developed in 1980 and amended in 1986, I believe, really set down some specifics in terms of guidelines that must be met according to the FDA. In addition, those facilities must be inspected on an annual basis. None of this applies to this group of toddler drinks. It's completely unregulated. It's kind of a Wild West scenario, actually.
Some of what you're saying is making me a little worried. David and I both work with the AAP Council on Communications and Media. We've seen a lot of advertising techniques that aren't evidence-based. I mean, how worried should we be about the way these toddler formulas are marketed to families? Do you have any insights on this?
I think you should be very concerned, actually. They are not required to have any scientific evidence to support any structure function claim. And so it's quite typical that you will see on the drinks that they support immune function, they support brain and eye development. And of course, none of this is backed by any scientific evidence, nor is it regulated. So they make a variety of claims. And these claims have actually translated to perception of parents that this group of drinks provide nutrients that other foods, including cow milk and a balanced diet, do not provide for their children. About 60% in one study showed that parents felt that, based on the advertising, that these toddler drinks provided something unique.
I love that you're talking about healthy diet, because when a 1-year-old and their family come in for a health maintenance exam at this point, what sort of nutritional assessment should we be doing?
Well, that's a great question, David. There actually, I think, is a common misconception amongst many, including pediatricians, that many toddlers and infants and young children are at risk for not having a balanced diet. In fact, there are a couple of very well done assessments of this. And actually, it's very uncommon that a child is not getting a balanced diet for all the required nutrients. And so there's not a whole lot of specific across-the-board counseling that's required. I would say that perhaps vitamin D, vitamin E, and maybe fiber is lacking in a substantial number, but not the majority by any means. And so most infants and toddlers are actually getting a balanced diet. They should get fortified foods, and that would be cow milk that's fortified, of course. And most commercially purchased cow milk in this country is fortified. Cereals that are fortified. And again, this is not generally an issue because going to the store and just buying them off the shelf, most of them are fortified. So I would try to identify those children that seem to be at risk for food insecurity, or if the parent is very illiterate nutritionally, and just take a brief, maybe dietary recall of what they fed the child in the last few days. And if there are any glaring omissions, then target those children for the foods that they may be lacking.
And if families bring up these toddler or older infant young child formulas, what should we be telling them?
I think my message to the parents would be there's no advantage to them. There are potentially significant disadvantages with the added sugars. In addition, the cost difference between the toddler drinks and whole cow milk is really quite dramatic. On average, I think it's about 2 to 6 or 7 cents per ounce for cow milk. These toddler formulas at the low end, maybe 30 cents per ounce, but more typically like $1 or $1.25 per ounce. So they are significantly more expensive.
Our first question was about definitions. And George, I want to get back to that because after listening to you talk, should these even be called formulas? Isn't that kind of confusing for families?
It's very confusing, and that's, of course, intentional because the formula companies have tried to make this connection between infant formulas and these toddler drinks, conveying that there's a unending continuum from infant formula to these toddler drinks that are required for their infant. So that is actually one of our recommendations in this clinical report, is to not call them formulas and instead call them drinks or beverages.
All right, drinks or beverages. Any last takeaway for our listeners about these drinks or beverages?
Well, actually, there are several. There should be, in the promotional materials and marketing, there should be a clear and unambiguous distinction from these older infant and young child formulas from infant formulas. They should not be linked in any way in terms of numerical steps, for example, step 1, step 2, etc., sequential names. They should not be linked to infant formula. Further, they should not be placed alongside infant formulas in store shelves. All of this conveys the notion that there's a formula continuum from infant formula to these toddler drinks, and that they're all equally essential, which is quite clearly not the case.
Usually our takeaway is the last question, but I do have a follow-up. Can you distinguish between these toddler or older infant young child formulas and some of the things that we might prescribe for children whose growth is not going well? For example, Pediasure.
Well, they are quite different. The formulas such as Pediasure are nutritionally complete. In other words, if that's all the child was receiving, if they were getting tube feeds or something along those lines, that could sustain their growth and development quite well. That's not the case of these toddler drinks. They are not at all nutritionally complete.
Thank you. I really, really wanted that. And I think Joanna is nodding. I think for our audience, that's going to be really critical because it kind of all looks the same, right?
Well, David, the real dilemma is if you go, and I challenge all your listeners to go to if they haven't recently, go to Walmart or Amazon and look up just put toddler formula, toddler drinks, infant formulas. And it will, as I said earlier, make your head spin. They have such similar names, you can't tell the difference. And sometimes it's only in fine print that a toddler drink says this is not intended for sole nutritional use. Otherwise, you wouldn't know that, you could not tell the difference. They're both called Grow and Gain or Grow, something similar. It's incredibly confusing, and it's hard to believe that this isn't intentional, frankly.
Well, Dr. George Fuchs, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for paying such close attention to those labels.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
To read the paper, Older Infant Young Child Formulas, go to our website at aap.org/podcast.
Coming up, we'll look at alarming research about pediatric firearm injury and measures we can take to protect children.
I am stressed, David, because when this recording gets released, I don't know if it will be on the heels or on the same day of a mass shooting in our country.
Life in America has become synonymous with gun violence. I can't remember another time in my life when this was the case. It's overwhelming. It feels crazy, and we need to find a way to change it.
And I think there are ways we can. We can start as pediatricians by really understanding how guns have affected the children that we care for. And I'm proud that the journal Pediatrics has taken the lead in publishing this data for us. David, do you remember the last time we had Dr. Jen Hoffmann on the show?
Yeah, she joined us on an episode talking about emergency mental health visits. Isn't she an emergency medicine doctor?
You are correct. It was episode 148. And Dr. Hoffmann is an assistant professor of pediatrics at Northwestern University and a pediatric emergency physician and researcher at the Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago. She's also the first author on a new paper in pediatrics, Pediatric Firearm Injury Emergency Department Visits, 2017 to 2022, a multi-center study. Dr. Hoffmann, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Joanna and David, for having me back.
Okay, as the title suggests, this study covers pediatric firearm injury from 2017 to 2022. Why this date range?
By studying firearm injuries from 2017 to 2022, that captured data from a few years before and a few years after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. We knew from prior studies that pediatric firearm injuries increased during the early pandemic. That was a period of increased firearm purchasing and also decreased economic stability. And we wanted to see if those trends persisted into 2022, which was the most recent year of data we had available.
What sort of injury patterns in children did you imagine you might see when you embarked on this study?
Well, David, we expected to see a seasonality of pediatric firearm injury visits. They always peak in the summer and are lower in the winter. But we wanted to also see if those visits had increased after the pandemic compared to before.
And in looking at these injury patterns, I think our listeners might be well versed in what PCARN stands for, but can you break down that acronym and what data you got from it?
Sure. PCARN stands for the Pediatric Emergency Care Applied Research Network. It's a research network that conducts multi-center studies related to acute injuries and illnesses in children. And for this study, we specifically used the PCARN registry, which compiles electronic health record data from 9 children's hospitals across the country. Using this data, we looked to see how characteristics of firearm visits changed before and after pandemic onset. And in particular, we looked at and used data on visits before the pandemic to predict how many visits we would expect after the pandemic. We then compared the expected visits to the actual number of visits that occurred.
And when you evaluated the results, how did emergency visits and firearm injuries end up actually changing, starting with before and then during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, in this study, we identified just under 2,000 emergency visits by children for firearm injuries across these years. We found that about half of visits were by older adolescents, 15 to 17 years old. The majority were male. 2 out of 3 were non-Hispanic Black, and 2 out of 3 were by children from neighborhoods with a very low Child Opportunity Index. The Child Opportunity Index is a composite measure of neighborhood opportunities that encompasses education, health and environment, and social and economic factors. After looking at the total study population, we then compared visits before versus during the pandemic. For our main finding, unfortunately, we found that emergency visits by children for firearm injuries doubled from 18 visits per 30 days before the pandemic to 36 visits per 30 days during the pandemic. And we also found some signals of higher injury severity among these visits. Specifically, we found that visits resulting in death in the emergency department or hospital doubled from 3% to 6% of all firearm injury visits.
When you were talking, Jen, I thought there would be an increase in firearm injuries, but a doubling of ED visits for these, I'm almost speechless. And you started covering this in the beginning of the data, but can you say again which children were at greatest risk of coming in with a firearm injury?
Thank you for that question. We did find different trends among different populations of children. So compared to visits before the pandemic, we found increases only among older adolescents, 10 to 17 years old, but not for younger children under 10. We found that visits increased among both males and females, and we found increases in firearm visits among Black and Hispanic youth, but not for white youth. Among those youth, visits remained roughly stable. And then finally, we did look at differences by Child Opportunity Index, and we found increases in firearm visits among children from very low, as well as high Child Opportunity Index areas. Because we found that these increases cut across socioeconomic strata, this really indicates that no child in our society is now immune to these increases in firearm injuries.
So I'm right there with Joanna, where I'm still in shock about this dramatic increase in visits and firearm injuries. Why do you think this happened? And is there something that we can do to reverse this trend?
David, we can guess why this may be happening. It could be due to increases in firearm purchasing or differences in storage patterns. But the reality is that we don't know why firearm injuries are increasing to this extent. And that's because we as a research community haven't been able to study and understand firearm injuries in the same way we've been able to learn deeply about other injury types, such as motor vehicle collisions. For nearly 25 years, federal funding was banned for studying firearm injuries, and current research on these injuries is substantially underfunded relative to the mortality burden. One other study showed that only about 600 research dollars are spent for each pediatric firearm death in the U.S., and that's compared to about $200,000 for each pediatric cancer death. But, what we've learned through our work in preventing other types of childhood injuries is that it's so important to take a public health approach that's focused first on harm reduction. So to prevent motor vehicle accidents, we focused on increasing vehicle safety and decreasing user error. We didn't focus on removing cars from the road. And similarly, there are opportunities to reduce the harm that can be caused by firearms to children. This comes in several different categories. We can advance gun safety technology, such as through smart guns, where biometric fingerprints are used, similar to how you open your cell phone with a fingerprint, and that can prevent a gun from being used by an unauthorized user. And we also need to advance policy solutions. We need stronger legislation at the state level that we know is associated with decreased firearm deaths in children. And this includes evidence-based policies, including universal background checks, child access prevention laws, which hold firearm owners liable if a child is able to or does access a firearm, and red flag laws, otherwise known as extreme risk protection order laws. These prohibit individuals at risk from harming themselves or others from purchasing or owning a firearm by a court order and may allow for temporary removal of firearms. So overall, there's many ways that we can try to reverse this trend as pediatricians, whether it's through research or policy or advocacy.
And I want our listeners to just rewind the last few minutes and know that there are things that we can do to advocate to change this situation. And Jen, thank you so much for coming here, for talking about this data. And do you have any last takeaways you can leave us with as we think about this doubling of firearm injury?
Joanna, there are so many things that the individual pediatrician on the ground can do, and this starts in the clinic with counseling on safe storage among the families you see. We know that for many of these firearm injuries, the gun involved is one that's found within the home. So guns should be stored unloaded, locked, and with the ammunition locked separately. Pediatricians can also counsel parents to ask about firearms in the homes where children are visiting if they go for a play date. And pediatricians can talk to parents about the risk of suicide among teenagers, acknowledging that many teens who die by suicide don't have a long-standing history of mental health problems, and decreasing access to firearms is one of the most effective ways we have to prevent suicide among teenagers. But overall, the message that I'd like to leave you with is that as pediatricians, we can accomplish so much more in advocacy when we work together. So consider working with others in your local health system, at the state, and even at the national level. Here locally, I worked with some of our fellows to start a program to distribute cable gun locks and other safe storage devices in our own emergency department. But there are many ways you can get involved in your local AAP chapter. You can attend the annual AAP Advocacy Conference. But no matter which approach you take, every pediatrician needs to see this data and find their own way to do their part in addressing this increase in pediatric firearm injuries.
Well, Dr. Jennifer Hoffmann, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, David.
To read the paper, Pediatric Firearm Injury Emergency Department Visits 2017 to 2022, a multi-center study, visit our website, aap.org/podcast.
This week, instead of our Say Ah, we're airing a segment we call Giving Voice, where we hear from pediatricians in our audience. Dr. Brian Credo is a fellow of the AAP who has spent the majority of his career specializing in adolescent medicine and college health at Tulane School of Medicine.
Recently, he added a new line to his curriculum vitae as the director of a course in biomedicine for students at Archbishop Rummel High School, his alma mater. He shares ideas with us today from his hometown of Metairie, Louisiana, on the topic doctoring outside the clinic.
You've seen the look before on the faces of the parents you serve. Part apprehension, part exasperation, even perhaps a little bit of embarrassment. You have just finished giving a talk to a high school PTA on teens and emotional health, lessons from the pandemic. You donated your personal time. The talk is now over, and you begin to notice a not so small line of individual parents trying to maneuver their way to get your attention as you step down from the podium. Many of them are going to want your opinion on their own child's individual situation. Look, I came and gave the talk. Haven't I done enough? Allow me to take a few moments to tell you why I believe the answer for all of us should be an emphatic no, you haven't. Pediatricians, like most physicians, enjoy a somewhat elevated role in our society. Parents trust us to help with the most important thing in their lives, their children. A wise person once said, "It is a momentous decision to have a child. It is to decide forever to have your heart go walking around outside your body." The last 3 years have been rough on parents and teens alike. Many seniors in the class of 2020 did not get a senior prom or any of the other normal celebratory events of adolescence. Things that have long been considered staples of American teen life all seem to fade away behind a gauze-faced haze into spectral oblivion. It's not just that the activities went away, but that the chance for teens to learn the lessons that go with the activities went away as well. These events teach lessons about relating to adults, dating, the responsibilities that come with driving, etc. Oftentimes, teens will make mistakes, but if they can stay safe and learn from them, then all is not lost. They can use the bumps in the road on their way to becoming a wiser, more responsible adult. The question then becomes, how can we as pediatricians help these parents and teens who have had such rough sledding over the past few years? I would humbly suggest we start by getting out of our clinics more frequently and dropping in on natural teen environments, namely the schoolhouse. We can help parents simply by pointing out that many of their biggest concerns fall into the category of normal teen development. If you say it, it comes with some heft, and parents can begin to relax. This allows teens to relax a bit, which makes things better at home for everyone. If there are problems, then helping parents learn to spot red flags sooner rather than later could possibly save a life. Some parents may feel more comfortable asking an embarrassing question to you than they would their own primary care provider. Some parents may lack economic access, and others may simply benefit from having a fresh pair of eyes on a situation. Whatever the reason, volunteering in the community can have a far greater impact than you might imagine. You might make a simple PowerPoint about preventing teen suicide that can be shared with local parents and teachers. You might volunteer to help at a camp or school function. Your role as a mentor cannot be overestimated and could be life-saving. If we really go back in time and think about why we wanted to work with children in the first place, aren't these the type of thoughts that motivated us? I'm betting that for a majority of us, the answer is yes. Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, said that one of the deep secrets of life is that the only things that are really worth doing are what we do for others. I'm guessing he would have made a fine pediatrician. You are back at the talk, and the line of yearning faces is beginning to coalesce. As you begin to greet the first parent with a welcoming smile, you should have just one thought running through the back of your mind. How lucky you are to be in a position to help.
Thanks so much, Dr. Brian Credo, for giving us your voice.
That's it for today's episode. If you like Pediatrics on Call, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Pediatrics on Call.
Pediatrics on Call is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our producer and editor is Ann Johnsos. Our audio engineer is Doug Nagel. Joe Puskars is our associate producer, and Susan Martin is our executive producer. Our theme music was composed by Matthew Simonson. Join us next week when we'll talk about the lasting effects of preschool expulsion.
We'll speak with co-author of a new policy statement, Dr. Gail Williams. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. Thanks for listening.